Hello, and welcome to the 6th season of Plants Dig Soil, a podcast about realistic regen ag. I'm your host, Scott Gillespie, and I'm an author and independent agronomist from the Western Canadian prairies, specializing in climate-smart agriculture. I discuss scientifically proven practices that benefit the planet, and just as importantly, farmers' economic sustainability. Be sure to visit my website, www.plantsdigsoil.com, to learn about my book, Practical Regeneration, and for the services that I offer for farmers and agribusiness. So this version of the podcast, this episode of the podcast, is my newsletter, and I'm putting it into audio form, so I'll just start with it and go from there. I've been watching Mrs. Davis at the recommendation of a new friend. It's set in an alternative 2023 where an algorithm rules the world. People do tasks for her to earn wings. For people that want the glory without the work, they pay to level up, but their fate is in the hands of Mrs. Davis. And what about those that choose not to participate? They can make that choice, but Mrs. Davis uses her followers to cut off opportunities, sabotage their efforts, and pressure them to do things for her or face loss of points towards wings. Now, I've been pulling back from social media for a long time. I deleted Facebook 5 years ago. The more that I posted, the more that it wanted. I'm still going on X, which is Twitter, and I'm on LinkedIn, but much less so. I'll focus on the newsletter and an in-depth agronomy podcast every month, and I think that'll be it. I haven't quite decided if I want to stop posting to my WhatsApp channel on a regular basis or pare it down to just when I publish my newsletter and agronomy episode. Now, with that being said, thank you for allowing me to be in your ears a couple times a month. If you're a newsletter subscriber, then it's also once a month for that. If you want to get the newsletter, there's links in the podcast description, or you can just go to my website, www.plantsdigsoil.com, and then just look for the newsletter link in the top menu. So for the rest of this episode, I'm going to have a small business highlight, and then I have some of the articles that I thought were interesting from the regenerative agriculture sphere over the last month, and that will be it. And I just want to make one little note. The new friend that I have that recommended Mrs. Davis is Nicole, and we talked books on the GardenFork podcast. So I have a link in the newsletter, and then I also will put one in this episode description for it. So to highlight the business, one of the things that I do is I do a lot of speaking. So I've been in the media doing some episodes for Real Agriculture, and I've also had many articles written about me, or I have written for publications. I've also been on webinars, teaching through online across to anybody, and then also in the field. If you want to see these, there are links on my website in the speaking tab. There's also a lot of stuff in my media feed there too. So if you want to check that out and hire me from your next event, I do a lot of speaking. I teach at Lethbridge College to diploma and degree students, and I've created workshops for some organizations as well. On that note, in the next couple of weeks, I will be talking to a busload of teachers about biodiversity, grasslands, how agriculture can fit into it, and what regenerative agriculture is, because I've been invited to speak to the Teach the Teacher event where they're taking teachers around Alberta to learn about what is out here. So that's one of the things that I'll try to get some pictures and put them in my next month's newsletter. Now let's move on to the news that I found interesting over the last month. I'm going to start out with my podcast. So as I said, I'm going to do one agronomy episode every month, put a lot of effort into that rather than trying to do many in a month. So I had an episode called "Oh Phosphorus, Where Art Thou?" And that was another one that was borrowing a movie title. I had one called "Dude, Where's My Nitrogen?" back in the winter. And in this one, I focused on phosphorus because it's very elusive. This actually came as an offshoot of talk that I gave this winter on using cover crops for break years between forages. Now, that was delivered in person and to participants online, and it was recorded. So there is a link in the description to that particular podcast. Now, the high level summary of this is that you need to replace what you export. No biostimulant or cover crop is going to make new phosphorus for you. So check that out. And if you disagree or if you agree, I'd love to hear from you on it. So down to the news. These are just, I think, the important articles that I came across that I think are interesting for you to know. There's an article about how sterile flies replaced Lorsban for 2 onion growers. So Lorsban is one of the older, and I say one of the old nastier chemicals to work with. It's not something that people want to spray, but they had to spray for a particular pest. And they have been able to find a way to get a biological a biological that will control it. This is something that one farm on its own can't solve. So this was worked collaboratively. And it is something that is hard to commercialize because for the amount that it takes to develop, there's not a lot of money in it. It's hard to make it into a product. So I think it's a good example of what can be done when people work together on solutions. I have talked about this a lot before. This was an excellent article by Andy McGuire called The Pyramid Scheme of High Organic Amendment Rates. He has talked about this before. He was the one that first kind of clued me into this many, many years ago. He's written another article, and I think it actually, the idea of a pyramid scheme makes a lot of sense when we're talking about amendments. So I'll just give you the one quote from the article, and then I think you should read it. It's an often overlooked but important fact about organic amendments like compost, manure, and biochar. Before these organic materials were composted, turned into manure through livestock, or pyrolyzed into biochar, they were plants fixing carbon through photosynthesis on a piece of land. And when we apply an amendment to soil where it was not originally grown, the soil where it was grown is deprived of the carbon and other nutrients that were in that biomass. I couldn't have said it any better. That's about the shortest and sweetest you can get. But he has nice diagrams of it and ways to think through it. But you've definitely got to check that out. Now, one that is related to that is about humic substances. This one is from a gardener that I have followed for quite a while, and I think he's right on in this. He, I think, has a lot of the same attitude that I have towards the gardening world. If you think the agriculture world has lots of products and ideas and unbelievable things, the gardening world is just 10 times worse. So the title is Humic Substances Like Humic Acid, Are They Good for the Garden? Now, like the substances that are mentioned above, like the biochar, manure, compost, humic acid is just old plant material that's being moved to a new location. Now, in this case, it's not recent. It's just somewhere on its way to becoming coal. Now, I have yet to find a study that shows their effectiveness. The companies selling them will have their own data to show they work, along with farmer testimonials. But at best, they are good nutrient carriers to prevent tie-up in the soil. But in and of themselves, they don't do a whole lot. So gardeners can apply much, much more product per square foot than any farmer will. So if studies can't see a benefit, how can it ever make sense for farmers to use them? And this one here was really interesting. It fit in really well with those other two stories called Farmers Big Soil Health Strides. So Agriculture Canada says that the prairie region saw significant improvements in soil organic carbon from the 1980s through the 2010s because farmers abandoned summer fallow and adopted no-till practices. Ag Canada estimates the soil carbon gains in many parts of Saskatchewan and Alberta at more than 1,200 kilograms per hectare or 1070 pounds per acre. So this is really interesting, is that it seems like soil health, it's a long process. It takes basic ideas or I guess fundamental ideas, and it's run out to do this. And When you read the article, you'll see compost, manure, biochar, or humic substances were not a part of this. That was not what made the soil healthier. Now, we're finally getting to what I had for the title of this episode about how nature and agriculture can work together or actually benefit each other. It's called Why Crops May Not Be Best for Underperforming Acres. Now, I used this in my precision agriculture class, using data from combines and satellite to determine the areas that don't make money or lose you money and let nature use them. This can also give a slight help to the crop that's in the halo, which is the area around the natural area. Related to that is another article, Creepy Crawlies Protect Apples When Flowers Are Planted on Farms. It's a very similar concept, except that it's just around the border of orchards. There is a real effect to having a natural area that is around the orchard, and it does help to lower pests. Now, there are still pests, but it lowers them. And finally, one other article that I found interesting that I think you should know about. Polycrop grazing has benefits, but also pitfalls. So I am not an animal nutritionist. This is why when farmers want to start feeding crops to livestock, I defer to the experts. And I'll put links to these two people's businesses, Karen Lindquist and Barry Yerameko, are who I go to first on this. There is sulfur that can come from brassicas, which are turnip, kale, radish, canola, or mustard. There's nitrates that can come from immature warm season grasses or frost-killed or drought-stressed cereals. And there's prussic acid from sorghum Sudan grass and glycosides from hairy vetch seeds that can lead to severe health issues or death. So just a caution that these poly mixes, these multi-species cover crop mixes or cocktail cover crop mixes, there are benefits to them. One of the biggest drawbacks I see to them is their cost and establishment of them. Sometimes getting them established can be a little more challenging. And there are benefits when they are used properly, but you do need to be watching them a lot more carefully. So with that, thank you again for listening, and I will talk to you again next